U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has arrived here in South Korea to address bilateral economic matters and broader security concerns amid a series of short-range ballistic missile launches by North Korea this week. So how are pundits assessing Pyongyang's persistent provocations? And what are the prospects regarding U.S.-China tensions over Taiwan? Meanwhile, how should Seoul seek to navigate the current climate of geopolitical challenges? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Earlier on this Thursday, President Yoon Suk-yeol and U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris sat down for talks at the top office. For more on bilateral ties as well as broader regional matters, I have Dr. James Kim at the Asan Institute of Policy Studies live on the line. Dr. Kim, it's a pleasure. Dr. Kim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right, all right. I also have Dr. Erik Mobrand at RAND Corporation joining this session virtually. Dr. Mobrand, it's good to have you on as well.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Right, Dr. Kim, first then, on the security front, President Yoon Suk-yeol and visiting Vice President Kamala Harris touched upon issues of mutual concern. That being said, which issues do you believe are of utmost importance, perhaps, to bilateral ties?
Well, obviously, North Korea is probably an important concern for the South Korean government. But based on the readouts from the government, it seems Taiwan was also discussed, and as well as South Korea's deepening role in the Indo-Pacific.
Right, and speaking about Taiwan, Dr. Mobrand, what have been the ripple effects in the U.S. following U.S. President Joe Biden's pledge of military support for Taiwan in the event of a Chinese offensive?
Well, these comments were made in our current context of growing uncertainty and complexity on security matters in the Asian region. And this uncertainty is destabilizing. It can lead to unfortunate mistakes. For decades, the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan Strait gave us an important measure of stability. Strategic ambiguity meant that Washington would recognize the People's Republic of China as the only China, and that it would not give a security guarantee to Taiwan, but at the same time, it would help arm Taiwan under the guise of a security partnership. That arrangement is now eroding. Officially, the U.S. will not commit, of course, to defending Taiwan, but now President Biden has on multiple occasions made extemporaneous comments against U.S. policy. These comments seem to reflect prevarication and would seem only to boost uncertainty. I see this as a shift from strategic ambiguity and toward confusion. And I think that confusion, that uncertainty is a danger for slipping toward conflict. And it's occurring in this region where many countries, including, of course, South Korea, feel increasingly squeezed in this heightened rivalry between China and the United States. With hope, we can have leaders who find ways to de-escalate these sorts of tensions.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Kim, speaking on CNN, President Yoon claimed that North Korea may engage in greater provocations in the event of China attacking Taiwan. Do you share this outlook?
It's certainly a possibility that the alliance cannot rule out when it comes to different scenarios related to North Korea. So I think it's prudent for the United States, South Korea, and even Japan to consider and have in place a game plan for this contingency should it arise. Hopefully it will not come to this, but in the event that it does, the alliance should have a risk mitigation plan to address this concern.
Right, and keeping in mind what Dr. Kim has said, Dr. Mobrand, what indeed are the chances of a violent confrontation between China and Taiwan in the near future?
That's a huge question and a very important one. I think what we can say is that compared to about 10 years ago, both Beijing and Washington have taken up actions and positions that increase the likelihood of conflict on the Taiwan Strait. China has, of course, expanded its presence in maritime Asia. In the United States, a decade ago or so, many in the policy establishment sought ways to partner with an increasingly influential China, even if they were wary of this country that was growing. Today, I think there's really bipartisan agreement in the United States on containing China, on competing against China as a rival. And that's a big, quick shift, and it keeps tension at a high level. Still, I think conflict is not inevitable on the Taiwan Strait. I think the current leadership of the PRC has put itself in a position where it turns to a kind of jingoistic nationalism in order to claim support. But the PRC, like every place, has politics, and there's certainly differing views within China about what the Chinese nation should be all about and what the aims of the PRC state should be. I think it's also worth pointing out that we're currently in a rather sensitive time period. Next month, we have a party congress in China, and it's expected that President Xi will be announced as serving a third term as the leader in a break with tradition. So what we may be seeing today is a kind of saber rattling, and we might hope for some de-escalation toward the end of this year.
Right, hopefully, of course. Dr. Kim, in the meantime then, how should South Korea seek to perhaps navigate this tide of tensions, if I may, between the U.S. and China over Taiwan?
I think we need to begin with certain realities about the bilateral relationship between South Korea and China, as well as South Korea and the United States. So while China is South Korea's largest trading partner, Seoul is a treaty-bound ally of the United States. And if you look at the Mutual Defense Treaty, Article 3 states explicitly that an armed attack in the Pacific on either the U.S. or South Korea would necessarily trigger an action by the other country to meet the common danger, quote unquote, meet the common danger. So what this means is that if there's an armed conflict involving either South Korea or the U.S. in the Pacific region, the other country will be obligated to intervene accordingly. And in terms of the type of intervention that we can think about, we can consider a range of possibilities, but some examples which we can draw from and gather is by observing how the European nations are assisting Ukraine over the past several months through this crisis. So there are several options here on the table, but it would necessarily tie Korea in if there is any conflict in the Pacific involving the United States and vice versa.
Right. Dr. Mobrand, North Korea has test-fired a total of 3 missiles this particular week, just ahead of U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris's arrival here in South Korea. And intelligence authorities here in South Korea have forecast that North Korea may conduct a 7th nuclear test as early as mid-October. All this being said, how are pundits like yourself in the U.S. actually responding to these beyond-border efforts to perhaps better address Pyongyang's persistent provocations?
Well, I think the punditry can sometimes be a little bit distracting and not necessarily any better than the discussions that happened there in Seoul. I think the missile tests point to the rising level of uncertainty and tension on the peninsula. Seoul had earlier proposed a so-called kill chain that would set the elimination of the leadership in Pyongyang as its target. And now what we see is North Korea responding to Seoul's threat of preemptive attack on its leadership by saying, that it can demonstrate its capability to undertake a preemptive attack. So the tension has gone up a notch or two here. We know, of course, that Vice President Harris will be visiting the demilitarized zone. And I think that appearance is to reassure South Korea of American support against North Korea. I'd be surprised, though, if Vice President Harris is also not warning President Yoon about provoking North Korea and drawing the U.S. into a conflict for the reasons that Dr. Kim just gave that relate to the alliance. At the same time, this visit takes place in the context of a proclaimed shift in ROK-U.S. relations, a shift from a narrow alliance focused on defense of South Korea against North Korea to a wider partnership or regional mission to sustain rules-based cooperation and engagement in the wider region. In advance of her trip, Vice President Harris told Prime Minister Han that the alliance with South Korea is the linchpin of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's quite interesting, and it follows on similar wording that was made after the summit between President Biden and President Yoon back in May. It's a big shift going from the narrow military alliance focused on North Korea to something regional. And I would guess that President Yoon and Vice President Harris will be discussing that as well.
Right. Meanwhile, beyond security, Dr. Kim, on the economic front, concerns regarding the exclusion of tax credits for electric vehicles assembled outside of North America were actually relayed to Vice President Harris, and she, in response, spoke about efforts to address this matter. That being said, how do you see this particular dilemma playing out, Dr. Kim?
That's a great question. And I think both sides are making due diligent effort to address this issue. I think there's a bit of a wiggle room for the administration in D.C. through either amendment to the existing legislation after the midterm or through executive orders issued by the president. But we have to be mindful that there are winners and losers on all sides when it comes to any change in the regulatory environment. Just as there are many companies that have had something to complain about when it comes to the IRA, there are many companies that stood to benefit from the legislation. These include Korean companies that have manufacturing facilities in the U.S. That stood to benefit from the passage of the IRA. And secondly, I think it's important to understand that South Korea is not the only country that have voiced some complaint about this law. Several European countries, as well as Japan, have also voiced their own complaints. But we need to understand, first and foremost, that this legislation was really a product of months of negotiation among various interests spread across the Democratic Party in Washington. And the main concern driving their decision to pass this legislation was addressing concerns related to the domestic investments in the U.S. And climate change, while addressing the challenge associated with inflation. So there were a lot of domestic consideration that went into this, and we need to be mindful of that particular reality as we head into the midterms in November.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Mobrand, the Yoon administration has called on the U.S., its U.S. counterpart that is, to perhaps postpone the implementation of this particular regulation until the year 2025, which would be when Hyundai Motor opens its factory in Georgia. What do you believe are the prospects of such a postponement?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think the legislation is a bit surprising to U.S. consumers, given the popularity here in the U.S. of Korean cars. The affordability and reliability of Kia and Hyundai manufactured automobiles, including the electronic vehicles, has long made them attractive to U.S. Consumers. But as Dr. Kim mentions, the idea here is to combat inflation and deal with these other economic and environmental concerns. I think this tax credits issue points exactly to the complexity that has developed in security affairs in the Asia Pacific. In particular, it points us to the ways that economic affairs have become linked into security recently. So for reasons of national security pursued through the Indo-Pacific strategy, we have the United States and South Korea seeking to expand economic partnership in ways that would limit supply chain dependence on China. The idea, of course, is that weaning a country like South Korea off of Chinese manufacturing to some extent could help to give Seoul greater autonomy vis-a-vis Beijing. And this is a long-term and really difficult task. I don't think anyone has the answers to it. In the course of talking about this problem, Seoul agreed to do more investment in the United States and to establish manufacturing bases. And now, faced with severe economic challenges at home, the United States is considering this measure that would be really disappointing to South Korea and its manufacturers. So here we have an economic policy that is then impinging on policies that were made for national security reasons. And I think that's kind of the crux of the issue.
Which is why it makes it so difficult, I suppose. All right, Dr. Mobrand, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.